Brian. Brian's a partner here at Arcview, and the more I get to know Arcview, the more I like it. You're developing and curating investment opportunities in Asia. That's sort of your current specialty. Thank you for doing all of that research for us. Can you tell me two questions really? How is the Asian market unique, and who are going to be the first investors in that market?
Well, first, I'd like to thank you for the kind words about Arcview. I would say for the Asian markets, I think it's a blank map. If you look at any kind of projections or any kind of analytics about the global cannabis market, what you'll notice is that there's this huge blank that covers the entirety of a quarter or more of the world. That's Asia and Southeast Asia, ex-Australia. And some of you might have heard that over the past 3 to 6 months that 2 different countries, South Korea and Thailand, have legalized medical marijuana. But what we're really looking at is that Asia overall is extremely early. Different countries have different kind of rules, and I would generally categorize these rules as hemp only, medical marijuana, or export only. I think those are going to be the frameworks, and it's going to be unique to each country. So, for example, Thailand has been extremely forward with its attitude towards cannabis. Medical marijuana has been legalized, and there's been talks of possibly pushing for recreational legalization. But from the perspective of actual Western companies that are interested in going into Thailand, that has been very difficult. South Korea, same thing. And so what we're looking at, with Asia, the unique part of it is that I think a lot of people think that Asian countries are fundamentally against cannabis, that there's a very harsh attitude towards cannabis. And I think while that's true, that's actually not something that it has been going on for a really long time. It actually goes back to 1961 convention that, up till the 40s and the 50s, in many parts of Asia, cannabis and hemp were grown everywhere. It was post-1961 that a lot of the different countries started banning cannabis and hemp. So what we're seeing right now is the reemergence of different regulatory frameworks that's trying to reconcile the negative attitudes towards cannabis of the past 50 years with the realization that, okay, actually the rules that prevented us from, keeping on with the cannabis industry is sort of going away. So how do we bridge that gap? And the difference in the different countries is a demonstration of that, different ways of reconciling those two facts. And so I think the first investors that are going to really go into Asia are the strategic investors that have a global vision for the cannabis industry. Because those are the companies with the resources that are able to bet on those sort of fringe markets, emerging markets, just as they've done in Europe and South America. It takes a degree of risk. There's operational, regulatory complexities. And I think those will be the investors that are most interested in those markets.
Thank you. So, Sean, you're here with Israkan, closing your IPO round. Congratulations. Israkan is an Israel LP, and we've already heard the word awesome once with respect to Canada, but Sean and I were chatting yesterday, and Israel seems to be pretty cannabis awesome. There are a lot of advantages. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And then thank you so much for the introduction here, and thank you all for coming. So we believe that Israel is going to be the next global powerhouse of cannabis. And so that's for a number of reasons. If you're looking at the Canadian landscape and what's going to happen globally, is that to start out, all of the LPs start in Canada. That's where it was legal. That's where you could raise all the capital. But if you look at what the companies are doing now, a lot of the Canopies or T-Gods or what have you, they're all going to other countries in search of low-cost production. And so what that means is they're going into places like Colombia or Africa or Jamaica or other jurisdictions searching to reduce their cost of production. And so if you're looking at Israel, it's in a very similar climate, similar sun belt. We're getting 12 hours a day of sunshine. You have low humidity, so you don't have all the outdoor issues that places like Colombia have. And so it becomes very attractive from a climate standpoint on the cost of production. And now that's actually not the only thing. Israel was the first country in the world to legalize medical cannabis. And on top of that, it's also where all the research has been done for the last 50 years. A lot of you probably know the name Raphael Mechoulam by now. That is where at Hebrew University they discovered THC and CBD. So what we have in Israel is an incredible amount of technical talent from the biosciences side as well as from the cultivation side. And we also have an agricultural tech hub. So Israel actually grows about 80% of their own crops. So they're very sophisticated in greenhouse building. And on top of that, you also have, as of January, a legal export market where we can now begin exporting into the EU once Israel puts in the final touches onto the framework. So it's a very exciting time. We've seen this movie play out in Canada before, 4 or 5 years ago when they switched into the MMPR and subsequently the ACMPR system. And so now we're seeing it in Israel, where historically cannabis has been a very popular plant there and very well studied. And now I think that the game is just beginning in Israel.
Fantastic. So I actually had the time and the pleasure to talk to all of our panelists before this, and all of them said in a different way the same thing about coming into the cannabis industry in North America. How we've gone from stigma to cachet. How now, instead of being hidden, there's prestige. We're swaggering, we're strutting. It's acceptable. Globally, though, not everyone is there yet. So with respect to your brands and what you're doing, how do you navigate cultural differences? And if you're looking for licensing in a different jurisdiction, can you give us a story or an example of sort of a nuance that you had to bring, ways you had to change outside of North America? Anyone?
Sure. The way Havana has approached branding is really localized. We have a number of brands under our umbrella, and most of them have been built for a specific segment or a specific target audience. One of the examples is our network of cannabis clinics in Canada called Canaway that is very much focused on real medical issues and also targets in to physicians and looks to appeal to the medical community. In contrast to that, we have recreational licenses in both Manitoba and Saskatchewan, and that audience is a completely different segment of the market. And so the way we've developed that, we've used through the Garden Variety brand originally that we formed in Manitoba. We have a design element which some people might interpret as breaking the regulations around marketing, because we've used what we refer to as a spare wolf. And this is partially a contribution from our First Nation partners in Manitoba and incorporating the elements that we identified as appealing for the market in central Canada. Ultimately, as we move into the European Union, we've looked at wellness and health and wellness brands. And so the non-combustible product forms that we look to expand into the European Union, as an example, is under a different brand, Alivia. And that's really targeting a European consumer base, separate from our Havana brand and separate from all the other localized brands. When we look at our parent company, Mera, Mera's essentially oversees all of our portfolio companies, and Mera's really targeted towards one specific audience as well, and that's investors. And so I think when we look at moving into new jurisdictions outside of Canada, outside of the United States, we have to be aware and conscious of the different cultures and standards, as well as who we're actually trying to target.
I have a story about the stigma because I think it's really funny. Look, I mean, the stigma is real, and when you go to Asia, especially like Singapore, or you go to especially Nordic countries, and you're meeting folks about investing in cannabis, like they won't meet you in a bar, they won't meet you in a restaurant. Everything's got to be top secret, and everyone wants to invest because everyone knows they can make a fortune in cannabis, but they're not out front about it because it's still, in a lot of places, it's just not something you talk about. But there are other places in the world where even in the cannabis industry, you become the one with the stigma. So I will tell you a great story. I went to Albania, which was a huge mistake. But if you don't know, Albania produces like most of the illegal marijuana. It's totally illegal there in all across Europe, and they're talking about legalizing. And we end up having dinner with the Prime Minister of Albania and with his Minister of Parliament, who is advancing the bill to legalize marijuana. Not a very popular guy in a country basically run by drug dealers. And you know, we're all drinking, and it's a long dinner. And towards the end of the night, he says, "What you do tomorrow?" Well, you know, we have a meeting with this guy, we have a meeting with that. No. Tomorrow, you come to my farm. And we looked at the woman who is running our delegation. It's like, he wants us to go to his farm, but we have all these meetings. She says, don't worry, cancel the meetings. He's really important. You got to go to his farm. It's a big deal. It's like, sure, you know, we pick you up hotel 9 o'clock. No problem. What kind of farm? Is it tomatoes or is it organic? What are you growing there? He says, oh, we have a purple kush, Afghan haze, you know. And I was like, I have this image. I mean, this is Albania. Like, I'm in the drugs business. I have an American passport. Like, there's no way I'm going to this guy's farm with the DEA drones flying over taking pictures of me, you know? And so that's, you know, sometimes you have to be the one with the stigma, because in this industry, you can end up getting into a lot of trouble if you don't kind of keep your own stigma up. And I'm really glad I did not go to his farm.
So am I. I'm very pleased that you are here today. I like white space because it presents opportunities, and in the global cannabis market, I still see a lot of white space. So maybe Brian and Sean, since if you're up for it, what closed market do you think is opening up next, and why?
Well, I'll take this one because Asia is pretty obvious, because every other market is already sort of open for business one way or the other. Europe, well, I guess the only one that's missing is sort of like the Middle East. Not as familiar with that, but the one to open up really is definitely Asia. It's very clear from the directions that are moving that Southeast Asia and Asia overall is open for business. So Thailand, what happened is, as Thailand pushed for legalization, what that has brought along is every single country around Thailand is also moving forward. So we're talking about Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, Myanmar, etc. Every single one of those countries is pushing for some kind of framework moving forward. If you look at the countries around the world, other than the developed nations, there's sort of a common trait, two common traits you'll find among these countries that have a positive attitude towards cannabis. First is that they're usually run by an autocratic, monarchical, dictatorial, some kind of iron fist government. And two is that they're poor, which is the case for a lot of these Southeast Asian countries that have a strong agrarian economy. And so many incentives for these countries to start legalizing and figure out some kind of program that works for their specific market. So short answer, Asia is definitely the market to open up.
Yeah, and I would like to add on to that as well. I mean, I'm an investor myself personally. I invest in a lot of different companies, starting out in Canada when legalization happened, and then subsequently in the US, and then now obviously in Israel. And from our perspective, one of the main markets, and it might sound a little bit odd to say it, that's opening is in the EU. And that's not even necessarily from a regulatory standpoint, although that certainly is the case, but it's also from an investment standpoint. So looking at the history of being able to invest in cannabis companies, it started out in 2014 when all the Canadian LPs started to go public. You had Tweed and then Organigram and so on and so forth. And then after that, around 2 years ago or so, you started to have US companies be able to take on investment. They started listing on the Canadian Securities Exchange. God bless, because it really opened up the boom for a lot of these companies. And then now what, at least in my opinion, what we're seeing is the new thing, which is now the EU, where there's still not a ton of companies. It's an incredibly large population, right? You have 740 million people in Europe as a whole. You have countries like the UK just recently legalized medical cannabis. And so what you have is a massive population. It's also a rich population. In places like Germany, you have medical subsidization of cannabis. And so you have this market that still doesn't really have a lot of companies and certainly doesn't have a lot of public companies. And so from an investment standpoint, people operating in the EU or selling into the EU have this exposure from an investment standpoint that really allows investors to get that early stage opportunity that they had 4 or 5 years ago in Canada, or they had a couple years ago in the US. And so from kind of my perspective, at least, is being out in Israel, where one, they just decriminalized cannabis, two, they just legalized exports of cannabis into the EU. We think that that's a wide open landscape and a great point for investors where you have a more or less established market that's also opening up from an investment standpoint.
Let it be known that China has a population with a B in it.
Right, I think that's important. You should point that out. That's good. I have a thought on this. I think it's, I'm gonna take something real complicated and make it real simple for everyone here. There's not a cannabis industry. There are 4 cannabis industries, right? And one of them is nutraceutical hemp, CBD, stuff like that, CBG, these kind of products taken from the hemp plant. This market is open in most of the world. So the question, if you're thinking of that market, it's not what's opening up next, it's like what hasn't opened up yet. Most of the world you can sell nutraceutical hemp products now, CBD and that kind of stuff. Then there's this other market that's kind of weird. It's prescription marijuana, things like Sativex and Epidiolex, which are made by pharmaceutical companies and which you don't get at a dispensary, right? Your doctor would write you a prescription, you would walk into like a CVS or a Pharmaprix, we call it in Canada, or Shoppers Drug Mart, and you would get pills, right? And prescription marijuana is very widespread, and many countries are allowing this sort of prescription marijuana thing. I'd say there's probably 40 countries in the world that are in that category. And we have a list, by the way, of Providence Brands of which country is in each category. And if you're interested, come find me. We can send it to you. Then there's this medical marijuana thing, right? Which means that your doctor basically writes you a pass to consume weed. And in the United States, you can go to a dispensary. In Canada, you can go online. In certain European countries, you go to a dispensary as well. And if you're medical, that's spreading as well. But there's still around 30 countries in the world that have allowed medical marijuana. And what's going to go next? Probably Asia. I agree with that. And a lot of European countries have already allowed medical marijuana. And then, of course, there's recreational marijuana, right? And recreational marijuana means that you just got to be of age. You don't need a prescription or a pass from your doctor. You just need to show your driver's license and show you're old enough and you go in and buy weed. And you're looking at 3 countries in the world that allow that, right? Canada, Luxembourg now, although they haven't written the rules, but it's a done deal in Luxembourg. Of course, Uruguay, but Uruguay you have to be a citizen, so it's a little bit different. So I have my predictions on recreational. I think what we're going to see next, Mexico, Malta is definitely eyeing it. Greece, Italy are all sort of on the verge of going recreational marijuana. And to me, that's when the big dollars start flowing in, when you go from medical to recreational most of the time.
Fantastic. So back to me. In Canada, I'm waiting for 2 things. First, U.S. federal legalization, and number 2, what Canada is going to do about it. I want us to drop the walls. I want us just to run into the import-export, do everything we can in the world globally as soon as we possibly can. But for our panelists, and why don't we start at the end with Zubin, because, well, he was just the last to speak. What do you want to see immediately after U.S. federal legalization? What's the next there for you or for your business?
So the U.S. market is definitely not a market that we want to ignore. Bank of America recently released a report about a week ago that identified the U.S. as the largest, single opportunity, representing about 35% of the total addressable market. But when we look at the different opportunities, we also want to build in what the level of competition is in each of these jurisdictions. And if we look at the US with the multi-state operators, the number of licenses, there's a certain competitive landscape that we need to keep into account, even though the market is of a certain size. It's definitely a market that we would look at very seriously, but I think when we are, as a Canadian entity, with a lot of the challenges around, moving towards federal legalization, I think there's, a couple pieces of legislation going through the U.S. right now that'll make it easier for U.S. operators to transact and do business. Doesn't necessarily make it legal federally, where a Canadian operator would be able to easily access that market. And so when we look at this space, like Canada represents only 3% of the total addressable market. And so when we look at where the opportunities lie for a company like us, it's really in the markets that lack production and infrastructure, and the European Union is a great example of that. Great point is Germany recently they've issued licenses or pending, I believe, to 3 different companies. And the total production across those 13 different lots is about 2,600 kilograms a year. So that equates to a small facility in Canada. And so, it's a fixed 4-year contract with BfArM, the federal regulator of medical products and devices. And ultimately, in order to bridge the gap between supply and demand, Germany is relying on imports. And so it's a much easier market for us to address. And when you look at the characteristics of Germany with the insurance coverage, with the focus on health and wellness, and with the amount of spending in the EU in general, like you look at total healthcare spending in the EU is about $2.7 trillion. So when you compare that to, a market like Mexico or even Latin and South America, it's a bigger opportunity for us. And for us to address even the European Union is going to be a lot of work. We want to make sure that the way we approach these new markets is strategic and we're operationally sound with how we're going about doing this, so that as we continue to grow and expand our business, we never lose sight of operational efficiency and effectiveness in deploying our strategy.
Okay, anyone else have a best case? U.S. legalizes. What do you want to happen next?
I mean, from my perspective, maybe the most clear-cut thing that will probably happen is the wave of consolidation that you'll see. So with all the different states, obviously we've seen the multi-state operators, but it's still difficult for companies and specifically significant companies to get large amounts of capital. We look at the liquor industry, and it's not every single state has their own large breweries that service everybody. Distribution is across the entire country, right? So there's certain structural things that happen in every industry that will certainly happen to cannabis. I mean, retail right now is very important, and distribution in the US is super fragmented, which is rather bizarre for any sort of mature industry. And so I think one of the big things that you'll see in the US, and that will also happen globally, is one will be a massive amount of consolidation. You'll probably also realistically see cultivation move from states like California, where there's very high minimum wage, to maybe states like Iowa, where it's a lot lower and it's just going to be cheaper to grow. And the other one that I think you'll see is branding. So there still aren't really national brands, and there certainly aren't international brands. And so the United States has had a long history of being able to create successful consumer brands. And so I think that will be one of the large ones. From a Canadian standpoint, Canada's been successful in being able to raise huge amounts of capital by being a first mover. And certainly some of that advantage will go away, I think, when the United States opens up and it's very easy to go to Goldman Sachs and raise $1 billion.
Thank you. So this is a room full of sophisticated investors and professionals. We make wise decisions. We do research. We put our money in safe places. If I want the biggest global gamble I can find, I want to put money down on something risky. Duma, where should I put my money and why?
Depends what kind of risk you're talking about. I think a really big risk is the Philippines, because you just might get killed. And it's also 100 million people, and no one wants to go there right now with who their president is. And there are a lot of medical marijuana opportunities there. I think it's really, really interesting. Brian, I don't know if you're touching that part of Asia at all. But aside from that, I think some of the other big risks are probably China. Brian and I have a friend who has received an export permit from the government and has something, I don't even know how much he has, but 100,000 acres of land that he's going to use to grow hemp and be ready to grow marijuana as soon as it's allowed. So you have a high stroke of the pen risk there. It could take a very long time for them to legalize marijuana, but if you get in from the hemp, you'll make some money, and you'll be really well poised to succeed when those governments do allow marijuana. But again, it's very hard. You need to know someone like Brian to get you into those kind of countries, because it's not, they don't necessarily do business in the same way that we do here in North America.
Okay, Brian, I want to hear from you on that now. The Philippines, tell me what you think. Where's my risky bet?
So I'm going to do it slightly backwards. I'm going to use some statistics and back into this answer. So if we thought about the cannabis industry using analogy, we think of it as a consumer industry, whether you make that comparison to consumables, nutrition, to alcohol, to tobacco, to any of these products. And the base that you're looking at is really just population. And if you narrow that down to sort of some of the categories that we just talked about, and the most, I guess, the least regulatory barrier is the nutraceutical CBD part of the equation, what we're looking at is either a functional usage, or we're looking at its effects in treating certain conditions that, the long list of conditions that cannabinoids can treat. And then we back into the answer really that I don't want to, repeat this so many times on this panel, but the biggest gamble, I think, is China. When we talk about a lot of conditions that CBD and other cannabinoids are supposed to treat, look at the aging population in China. With the one-child policy of the past century in China, China is going to have one of, I think, the largest, peaking at somewhere around 250 million people over age 65 by 2050. Actually, I think it's 350 million. I have to check those numbers. But when we look at the numbers and looking at the other industries that China dominates, China is the world's largest consumer of tobacco. It has the second largest area of vineyards under cultivation. The most valuable alcohol company in the world is actually in China. So looking at all these statistics, we think, barring any regulatory framework, barriers, if CBD and other cannabinoids based, whether it's pharmaceuticals or functional beverages or nutraceutical ingredients, whatever it might be, we think China will be a very big market and a worthy gamble.
Okay, thank you. Just to the audience, we've got maybe 5 minutes left. We have an amazing panel up here, so get those hands in the air if you want to ask a question. This is the end of the day, the end of the conference. It's now or never. Here's my question, and I want to, oh yes, hi.
So I wanted to ask around hemp and CBD, what do we see as the global regulations around moving that? Like the example of China, is that going to disrupt pricing in various countries, particularly for the US, but then also other countries?
I just have a thought on that, because all these folks, the CBD thing has gotten way out of hand, and it's crazy now. I mean, like, people's making CBD from yeast, that's cool. And people are making CBD from hops, that's cool too, right? And they're talking about how cheap they can do this, and we can do 7 grams per liter when we do it with yeast and all this. But if China comes online, none of those technologies, and it's starting to come online, none of those technologies will be able to compete from a price standpoint. I mean, they can just grow outdoors. They can lose most of the trichomes. It doesn't matter, because they have so much land and the labor is so inexpensive. And and if they can do it in a way that's clean and you don't have heavy metals and you don't have pesticides and all this, if they can figure that out, which I'm sure they can, they will run all of these new technologies to create cannabinoids out of business. That's my projection.
By the way, that's a terrible business to be in. Just trying to produce cannabinoids at the cheapest possible. That's it. It's a race to the bottom, and in 5 to 10 years, you're going to be worth, just a few $100 million in a, $200 billion industry. That's really not.
I agree, it's a terrible business, but I feel like a lot of the guys we know in China, that's what they're trying to do.
For sure.
That's the business that they want to be in.
Oh, and traditionally that's how it works, right? You look at vitamin C, you look at penicillin, all these low margin, like the most basic ingredients, they're all produced in China. So it's exactly to that point. It's to answer your question, in terms of pricing, I think it's not as simple as pricing. I think the story, the narrative around like California, Oregon, or high quality hemp oil, I think that's going to continue on, and that's going to be in a very different product category as just simply like what's the cheapest CBD isolate you can get your hands on. I think those are different categories, and if you are simply playing the field of, what is the cheapest ingredient, then yes, the answer is I think that it's not competitive to grow in the US or any of these major markets. But if you're talking about a different product category, the best high quality, terpenoid rich, full spec oil, I don't think that's something that that will be coming out of China.
Okay, that's actually a good lead into something I want to ask. We've got seconds for everyone to answer this question. We'll just go down the row. This is my thought. recreational cannabis, this is fictional, is legal everywhere. You can take any product to market. All the markets are the same size. What one product are you going to take? Where are you going to take it to make the most money? So it's a low margin, but these people do a lot of cannabis. Is it Bordeaux laced with a little bit of oil? What's the win in sort of a flat market scenario? Have fun.
Well, I guess I have to answer this because I have the product. We brew a really unique beer. You can see our coasters around here that are it's actually brewed from the cannabis plant. It is a premium product. It is totally unique, and that we have figured out a way to make something that's authentic. You know, an infused beverage, we think of like Tang. A beverage actually brewed from the cannabis plant, we think of like premium fresh squeezed orange juice. And to me, that is a product you go to market because it is exactly where this industry is going. The bottom is falling out of the commodity market. You know, look what happened in Oregon, right? And with China coming online, CBD is going to become, there's no value anymore in chasing commodities. If you're growing weed, you might as well be growing broccoli, in my opinion. The future is in branded products because think about the value of the wheat that goes into a Grey Goose bottle. It's about 25 cents worth of wheat that goes into that bottle of Grey Goose, and they sell it for up to 60 bucks Canadian at least. You know, that's where you get your margin. And what market I would sell it in? Of course I'd sell it in the United States because they, you know, they're big dumb consumers and they buy the most stuff. So I mean, it's, you know, it's a no-brainer.
Yeah, I mean, I largely agree as well. I mean, I think generally you kind of want to be in two areas. One would be an ultra premium brand, which allows you to command a hugely high premium, which would maybe be your Bordeaux. I think that's a great business model. I'm not certain if it's something I'd personally be in. And then the other one is certainly in branding in any capacity, but it's also just focusing on distribution. So especially right now is that if you have proper distribution, I mean, Budweiser in the US is nothing if the distributor drops them. And certainly in the US, distribution is one of the most important parts. And so with respect to branding, I think having a quality product, but more or less spending your majority on money on marketing and making sure you have distribution is really where you're going to stand out. Because at the end of the day, that is how you're going to make the most amount of money because you can command a huge audience. It's not a race to the bottom. You want to be a low-cost producer, but that doesn't mean the lowest cost producer. It means being able to perform profitably with having a low cost. And so what that means is that the margin that you have, you can spend on marketing and distribution.
I generally agree as well. I think when we look at branded products, the way to get to a branded product is to have a high quality product and consistency in delivering that product to consumers. And over time, that generates that, you know, brand value. So that's something that we are certainly looking at. And I would say that, you know, generally the market's moving away from, and certainly on the medical side, but I recognize this is questions focused on the rec side. But even on the rec side, I think you look at the data coming out of BDS Analytics for more mature states in the US, and you're seeing, you know, flower kind of flatlining. I believe it's around 40% consumption. I think if you're looking at vaping as well, I think over time, that's going to become a smaller component of the overall space. And I think more controlled dosage forms with a very reliable effect are going to be in high demand. And something simple like a capsule, for instance, is a processed value-add product. And provided you have a high-quality product and formulation, and you can consistently provide that, I think it's going to lead to substantial margins. And I would agree that, you know, overall, if you look at the world today, you'd probably focus on selling in the U.S. market for maximum exposure and profit.
Okay, oh my gosh, we did it bang on. Thank you for your attention. Thanks for listening, and have a great night.